the odd story of Alex Rodriguez's comeback season. Joel Sherman writes the baseball column for the New York Post and joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Robin.
And take us back to before the beginning of this season when Alex Rodriguez was pushing 40. He just served a season-long suspension for using performance-enhancing drugs, which he'd long denied. Is it fair to say that the Yankees management really just wanted him to go away?
Well, I think in their preference on multiple layers were that he go away. I think they were, concerned that he couldn't play baseball much anymore. He was 39. He had just had a second major hip surgery, and he couldn't catch up to a fastball the last time we saw them. Then there was the question of, them feeling duped by him and still having 3 years and about $60-odd million left, and they'd love to have gotten out of that money that they owed him. And plus, they were worried about him becoming some kind of distraction where people were just interested in the TMZ part of the Alex Rodriguez affair. And so I think there was huge concerns on all of those levels. And as it turned out, he's actually been one of the big success stories for the Yankees.
Yeah, talk about the season that he's had this year. And we should say the Yankees, to the surprise of many, are in first place in the American League East.
Yeah, and one of the reasons they're in first place in the American League East is maybe Alex Rodriguez hasn't played like prime Alex Rodriguez, but he certainly played like a prime-time player. There's been a bunch of times where he's had these little mini slumps and you thought, aha, here's the moment where he's done. His body is breaking down. He turned 40 in July. And instead, he's been a vital part of what's a greatly improved offense from the last two seasons. And he's also part of the fabric of leadership. I think even his greatest critics would agree that he's actually a baseball gym rat. He loves the game. And one of the things he likes best about it is working with young players and incorporating them into both the clubhouse life, the major league life, and feeding them with information. And so he's been an important part of the leadership fabric as well.
Just one question about something. You mentioned Alex Rodriguez's mini slumps, and every time he goes into one, people think, aha, there it is, I knew he was finished. In 2006, you wrote, time to face facts, A-Rod simply doesn't have it. Next year he hits 52 home runs and steals 24 bases. What is it about this guy, immensely talented, that he seems to be done for, and he just comes back?
Well, at that time, I would suspect that one of the things that helped bring him back was also what brought him to his suspension. He defied time, as a lot of players in that era defied time, by not playing legally.
You're saying performance-enhancing drugs?
Yes. I mean, clearly he was taking performance-enhancing drugs in 2010 and probably 2011 at the minimum, which probably helped him defy injury, recovery situations, and age. But, let's start with who he is. Alex Rodriguez was the first pick in the first round of a draft. I think anybody who did amateur scouting would tell you that in the last 40 years, if you get to somebody who's done amateur scouting in that period, there's maybe 2 or 3 players, the Ken Griffey Jr.'s, the Alex Rodriguez's, the Bryce Harpers, who stand out that they would be the first pick in the last 40 years of drafts if you put everyone together. So unique athletes tend to be able to last longer and be better than others. So he's a very successful player now. I have 2 children. I wouldn't bet their lives or my lives that he's doing it clean. And, let's hope he is. It's a greater story if he is, but he has kind of fooled us once already, and so the shame would be on me to believe him moving forward.
Joel Sherman of the New York Post and MLB Network Insider, thanks for talking with us.
Thank you.
It's All Things Considered on WNYC. I'm Richard Hake. It's 4:29. 17-year-old Nick Bain says spending all day in classrooms can feel like that classic Chocolate Factory episode of I Love Lucy.
All the chocolates are coming down the assembly line and you just have to get each one as they come, and with not a whole lot of thinking about an education in general.
So he set up an experiment to teach himself and escape the classroom for 6 months. We'll have that story coming up after the news headlines. The National Weather Service has issued a flood warning for parts of east central Somerset County in northern New Jersey. This until 7:30 tonight. There's a line of thunderstorms now moving over parts of New Jersey. You can expect mostly cloudy skies for tonight with some scattered showers and thunderstorms. They'll pop up. Humid as well tonight with lows in the lower 70s. This is WNYC.
When Rachel brought home a robotic baby from her sex ed class, she didn't expect to like it.
I never really thought that I would want to have a kid younger, but maybe I would. Like, this situation sort of set off some sort of trigger in my mind that was just like, I must hug caribou, must reproduce now.
I'm Hillary Frank, host of The Longest Shortest Time from WNYC. Join me for surprising stories of family and parenthood at longestshortesttime.com.
WNYC support comes from the Environmental Defense Fund, working to reduce oil and gas methane pollution. More information is available by following the Twitter hashtag #CutMethane. Geico, celebrating over 75 years of providing auto insurance for drivers across America. More information on auto insurance available at geico.com or 1-800-947-AUTO.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Craig Windham. Jared Fogle, the former spokesman for the Subway sandwich chain, has agreed to plead guilty to federal charges that he paid to engage in sex acts with children and that he received and distributed child pornography. Josh Minkle, U.S. Attorney for Indiana's Southern District, listed details of some of the allegations against Fogle.
He repeatedly traveled from Indiana to New York to engage in commercial sex acts with victims he knew to be children. This conduct began as early as 2010.
Under the plea deal, which still must be approved by a judge, Fogle would pay nearly $1.5 million in restitution to 14 young victims. The government agrees not to seek a sentence of more than 12.5 years in prison. Fogle's wife says she is seeking a divorce. Thousands of firefighters are battling wildfires throughout the western states. Danielle Carson says that task is hard enough in California without the problems posed by private drones, which are hovering over some of the blazes to record them.
They're called hover drones because they hover over wildfires and delay firefighting efforts. If a drone is hovering, air tankers carrying thousands of gallons of water or fire retardant get grounded. Mike Eaton, head of aviation operations in the San Bernardino forest, says drones are also a dangerous distraction for pilots.
They've got enough on their mind already with difficult terrain, difficult weather, winds, and other things. They don't need to be worrying about model airplanes or drones.
State lawmakers are considering a bill that would require identification numbers on drones. Another calls for slapping fines up to $5,000 on drone owners who interfere with emergency workers.
That's Danielle Carson in Los Angeles. Mexico's government is criticizing GOP presidential candidate Donald Trump for saying that if elected, he would deport millions of undocumented migrants. The Mexican Foreign Ministry says those remarks reflect prejudice, racism, or plain ignorance. This is NPR News.
And this is WNYC in New York. I'm Richard Hake. Governor Cuomo says he's agreeing with New Jersey officials and Transportation Secretary Anthony Fox that it's time to build a new tunnel under the Hudson River, even though he didn't attend their meeting on the subject yesterday.
So New York will do its fair share, but let's remember who owns the tunnel and the use of the tunnel, and we're starting to frame the proportionality of the discussion.
The current tunnel is damaged by Sandy, and officials say a new one needs to be built to add capacity, and so the old one can be fixed. Cuomo is calling on the federal government to pay for most of the project, though through grants and not through a loan. A new policy will give the mayor more control over public records released under Freedom of Information law requests. The mayor's lawyers will now review any requests for public information that could reflect directly on the mayor. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and President Obama have instituted similar policies, which transparency advocates say lead to prolonged delays. The de Blasio administration defends the practice, saying it's legal for government officials to discuss requests before releasing documents. Also, Mayor de Blasio says his administration is making an effort to enroll more low-income families in full pre-K classes this fall. He told WNYC's Brian Lehrer show this morning some parents haven't had an opportunity to learn about the program.
All of us have to do a better job helping people understand that full-day pre-K today is the equivalent of what, first grade was not long ago. It is now effectively a necessary foundation for success.
The city believes there are about 1,000 4-year-olds in central Brooklyn who still have not applied. The city has launched outreach efforts at street fairs, barbershops, salons, and churches. And Broadway shows will soon be much cheaper to see, at least for a few weeks next month. Some 22 shows are participating in Broadway Week, in which 2 tickets go for the price of 1. These special tickets go on sale starting tomorrow at 10:30 for performances only during September 7th through the 20th. We do have a flash flood warning for parts of New Jersey, east central Somerset County in northern New Jersey. It'll be mostly cloudy with some scattered showers and thunderstorms. There are some thunderstorms moving through New Jersey into New York on the northern part of New Jersey right now. Some of these storms could produce heavy rainfall tonight. It will be humid with lows in the lower 70s. Tomorrow, Thursday, mostly cloudy with a chance of showers and thunderstorms. Patchy fog as well in the morning. Continued humid. Highs will be in the mid-80s. This is WNYC at 4:35.
Support for NPR comes from member stations and from Barracuda Networks, offering cloud-connected storage solutions for protecting and recovering essential business data, including emails and files, virtual servers, and databases. More information is available at barracuda.com. And Angie's List, where members and visitors can shop and buy services from local businesses, including house cleaners, handymen, landscapers, and remodelers. Learn more at angieslist.com.
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Robert Siegel.
And I'm Audie Cornish. In Kentucky, you're not allowed to run for president and the U.S. Senate at the same time. State law is very clear about that. That's a problem for Republican Senator Rand Paul. So he's trying to craft a kind of insurance policy to keep his options open. He's pushing for a presidential caucus instead of a primary. It would allow him to run for Senate if he happened to become the GOP presidential nominee. Kentucky Republicans will decide the issue this weekend. Ashley Lopez of member station WFPL explains.
Throughout his short political career, Rand Paul has called himself a constitutional conservative. So it's not a surprise that his pitch to Kentucky Republicans in favor of a caucus relies on the Constitution.
We think there's going to be a constitutional argument that the states all have to have the same rules for federal election.
Not all states have laws like Kentucky's. So Paul's workaround is to have state Republicans vote separately for president next year by holding a presidential caucus in March. At Fancy Farm, the state's big political gathering a few weeks ago, Kentucky Republicans were divided on Paul's proposal. Katie Moyer is a fan of the first-term senator.
You know, I think he's doing a great job as senator. So I would support him regardless of what he did.
Carol Miller wants retired neurosurgeon Ben Carson to be the GOP's presidential nominee.
Rand Paul probably needs to decide if he wants to be president or if he wants to be a senator, you know. So.
Unlike a primary election where voters go to a polling place organized by the government, a caucus is run by a county's local GOP for registered Republicans. The logistics would be complicated. The volunteers needed to administer the election would need lots of training. Scott Lasley is a political ally of Rand Paul's who's pushing the caucus plan.
It's kind of a balancing act. What each county chair needs to understand is what the potential benefits are and what it's going to mean from their perspective to pull it off successfully.
Another issue with the proposed caucus is cost, about $500,000. To sweeten the deal, Paul's campaign has promised to come up with the money. Paul says he could challenge the constitutionality of the law standing in his way in court, but he says holding a caucus would be easier.
It's less expensive, less lengthy, just to ask your fellow party members, and you have a better chance asking your fellow party members than you do in the judiciary party.
Even Republicans who haven't made up their minds about Paul think a caucus makes more sense. Holding the caucus in March, unlike the usual primaries in May, means presidential candidates would be forced to campaign there. Eric Lane is the vice chair of the Nicholas County GOP.
I think it's going to bring a lot of attention to the state.
But there's one big question looming over the debate. Will Rand Paul's presidential campaign last that long? So far, Paul has lagged in both fundraising and attention. Lane says he likes the idea of a caucus, but he says Paul's campaign issues are a valid concern.
This campaign's not really picking up a lot of speed right at the moment, so I don't know if this is all going to be a wash anyway for him or not.
Ultimately, approval of the caucus is not a sure thing. It's up to the roughly 340 people who sit on the state party's central committee. And if it isn't approved, it would be yet another bump on the road, this time at home, for Paul's presidential ambitions. For NPR News, I'm Ashley Lopez in Louisville.
50 million children across the country will be heading back to school after a break this summer. And we're going to meet a student now who decided not to take the summer off. The 17-year-old is finishing an unusual experiment in learning. He's been teaching himself for the last 6 months. Colorado Public Radio's Jenny Brundin has his story.
Nick Bain was in class one day last fall when he decided to write down what he was doing every 15 minutes.
And I found that out of the 7-hour school day, there are usually about 2.5 to 3 hours that you actually really need to be in school.
To get instructions from the teacher, and the rest of the time was lunch, getting books from his locker, things like that. He loves his Denver school, the Colorado Academy, but just like it does for a lot of students, school seemed like a chore for Nick.
It sort of reminds me of, there's an I Love Lucy episode and she's trying to bag all the chocolates.
Now, the candy will pass by on this conveyor belt and continue into the next room where the girls will pack it.
And sometimes school feels a little bit like that, like all the chocolates are coming down the assembly line and you just have to get each one as they come. With not a whole lot of thinking about education in general.
So Nick came up with this idea, and he got his parents and the school on board. He'd take the same tests and write the same essays as other students in his class. But he'd never attend class. He graded pass, fail, and he would teach himself, pace himself. He'd take 7 courses, not the normal 4, calculus, AP Physics, advanced French. He'd even design some of his own, like philosophy.
This is Candide. I really like this, yeah.
He'd also work on a project with scientists, increasing phytoplankton concentration in the upper ocean to address ocean acidification and climate change. And last, he's in the beginning stages of designing a 1-seat model aircraft, which sits on his front porch.
So I just run down the street with this. Actually, there are 3 people.
Nick experimented with different ways to learn. First, he tried to learn a bit of a subject every day. That didn't go so well. Then he asked himself, what if he spent 10 hours a day on one subject?
Let's see, like Wednesday, I'll do calculus, or Thursday, I do French.
And eventually, he found that being steeped in something the whole day led him to learn more about it. So one day, he went to the Denver Botanic Gardens to read French literature all day.
Le Tour du Monde en 80 jours, which is
Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days.
And I'd been reading it, and I wasn't really liking it because I was sort of not understanding some things. By the end of the day, I realized I was reading the French as fast as I was reading the English. I remember walking back to my house and thinking, wow, I'm thinking in French.
Nick discovered his learning wasn't more efficient than in the classroom. He was spending every waking hour learning. His mom, Lisa Bain, says this is the hardest he's ever worked.
It's hard to get him to relax. So school sometimes allows you to have the downtime, but when you are self-directed, there is no time that's not something you could be doing.
Nick's genuine love for learning is extraordinary. But you see, at the beginning, Nick worried. Every time he wasn't studying, he was thinking, wow, I really need to get back to work. But he also noticed when he got stuck.
There's literally going to be nobody to get me started again. So I think it creates a condition where you just have a superhuman amount of motivation.
He says his learning was more satisfying. Even if it wasn't more efficient, it had more purpose. As days passed, Nick started to relax into the joy of learning. He could occasionally take breaks. Teaching himself to play piano. Because he was on a pass-fail system, Nick didn't worry about how to get a good grade. Instead, he worked hard at something because he wanted to. For his senior year this fall, he's going back to class. He sees learning with people matters a great deal. I asked him about one of his original questions. The project was to gain insight into how the process of school might be improved.
Gosh.
He'd like to see other students have the same opportunity he did to discover how they learn best. And this.
I can be 45 or 27 or just any age or doing anything and become an expert. It makes me really excited for the rest of my life, I guess, is that I know that it doesn't have to stop when I stop school.
The experiment's done, but the learning's never over. For NPR News, I'm Jenny Brandine.
You're listening to All Things Considered from NPR News. Sometimes when you're facing a crisis, it helps to hear how someone else dealt with a similar situation, say a really severe drought. That's why scientists from California have been getting on planes to Australia. NPR's Dan Charles explains.
California and Australia have a lot in common. They're both warm, sunny places, relatively prosperous. Australia is drier than California, though, even in normal times. But from 1995 to 2009, it suffered through the so-called Millennium Drought, longer and deeper than anything California has seen. And yet, says David Feldman from the University of California, Irvine, Australia came through it
with no discernible decline in the quality of life. I think there's a lesson there.
Feldman and several colleagues have taken several trips to Australia in recent years, trying to figure out what that lesson might be. Lots of Californians, in fact, have gone on this pilgrimage.
Australia is seen as a model that has prevailed, has created a kind of a resiliency.
Feldman says the thing that really struck him in Australia was the level of public awareness about water.
On the billboards, there were actually postings about the level of water remaining in the city's reservoirs.
Australians now treasure their water in a way that most Californians still don't, Feldman says. In Melbourne, the average person has been using just half as much water as the average person in LA, and you won't see nearly as many of those green, grassy lawns. But the biggest use of water by far in both Australia and California is for irrigation on farms. Agriculture is a huge industry in both places. And a lot of water experts say the single most important thing that Australia did was to create a new way of managing all that irrigation water. The old system in Australia was a lot like how it still works in California. If you owned a particular piece of land, you had a right to a particular amount of water, either from wells or from rivers.
It was really just seen as something that would come to your property, was joined to the land.
Tom Rooney is the founder of an Australian water trading company called Waterfind. He says even before the drought hit, Australia had done a giant reset of water rights. The government put a cap on the total amount of water available for farmers, and then farmers got shares of that total amount.